It's Chill to Know.
Where we like to take a look at listener-submitted sources and really pull out the key knowledge that you need to get up to speed quickly.
That's right.
Today, we're diving deep into Bill Perkins' Die with zero, or at least excerpts from it that you sent us.
Yeah.
It's not your typical financial advice book, is it?
It really isn't.
Really about maximizing your life experience and understanding the relationship between money and your time here on Earth and how those two things interact.
Right.
We're going to go through a bunch of different concepts today.
Yeah.
The importance of having experiences, this idea of a memory dividend, the shifting value of money as you age, and then just this whole concept of planning for the future in a way that actually maximizes your enjoyment of life versus just maximizing your dollars in the bank.
Right.
I think some of this stuff is pretty counterintuitive for a lot of people, so I think this should be a pretty fun deep dive for us.
Yeah, I think it's a way of looking at life and money that most people don't really think about until much later in life, and so it's good to get ahead of it.
Okay, so Perkins starts off the book with rule number 1, maximize your positive life experiences. And he really kicks it off with a pretty powerful story right away about Erin and her husband, John.
Yeah, and it really points out that none of us know how long we're going to live.
Right.
You know, they were successful lawyers, they had a good life, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, John's diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer at 35.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is a guy who's exercising, he's eating right, there's no indication that anything is wrong. And then he goes in for an x-ray because he's having some back pain. And it turns out that, you know, the cancer has spread all over his body already and he's terminal.
Yeah.
And it's just a complete shock to everyone. And so I think it really emphasizes that message that we don't know what tomorrow holds, so we need to make the most of the time that we have and not delay gratification indefinitely.
And this idea of what a fulfilling experience is very personal, right? He uses himself as an example. You know, he loves to travel, he loves poker, so he allocates a big percentage of his savings towards those two passions. But he's not saying that everybody needs to go out and blow their money on, you know, poker and travel, but just the idea of being very conscious of what it is that actually brings you joy.
Yeah, and it's about intentionality, right?
Right.
So what brings you joy, what makes you happy? Are you somebody who enjoys going out and doing all sorts of adventurous things? Or are you a homebody who finds happiness in quiet moments? Are you somebody who enjoys spending money on themselves? Or do you get more satisfaction from helping others? Like, whatever it is that you should do that. And it's about choosing those things consciously instead of just kind of floating through life on autopilot.
Right. It's not just being a leaf in the wind, right?
Yeah.
And he also talks about how timing is crucial to this.
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter how much money you have or how happy of a person you are naturally, that to get the maximum enjoyment or fulfillment out of an experience, you have to have it at the right time in your life. So you can't go back and relive your college days when you're 60 years old, you know?
Right.
So timing is really critical. And then, you know, he brings up this really interesting concept, I think, that really changes the way that I think about money. It's this idea of life energy.
Yeah.
Can you explain that a little bit?
So he talks about money representing your life energy. And what that really means is that when you're earning money, you're trading your time, your life force for that money.
Right.
And so when you spend money, you're spending a piece of your life. And it's really about thinking about how much of your life is this thing worth?
That's such an interesting concept, right? Because it's not just dollars and cents anymore. It's actually like, how much am I actually paying for this thing?
Yeah, and he says, he had this realization after reading a book that I actually read as well called Your Money or Your Life. And, you know, he had this sort of Matrix-like awakening where he realized, oh my God, like, I've been trading my life for all this stuff. And so he started calculating how many hours it took him to buy things. And, you know, if you're thinking about it that way, you might think twice before buying that, you know, fancy new shirt that you don't really need.
Yeah, it's a huge mind shift, I think, you know? And
Now, for me, it was.
it's funny, like I had this experience early on in my career. I was working for a very low salary in New York City.
Okay.
And I was trying to save every penny I could. And I remember, like, I even was driving my boss's limo at night just to make a little extra cash on the side. And I remember, like, feeling really good about myself one day. Like, I had saved, you know, maybe $1,000 or something. And I told my boss, I was like, hey, Joe, you know, look, I've saved this much money already. And I was expecting him to be like, wow, that's incredible. You're doing such a good job. And instead, he was basically like, you idiot.
Yeah.
You came here to make millions. Your earning power is going to happen. Why are you so focused on saving this small amount right now?
It's funny how that works because you came to New York to make money And yet you were so focused on saving a little bit of money that you weren't actually enjoying New York. And it sounds like he recognized that like you were so focused on saving that you were missing out on some experiences.
Yeah, it was kind of a slap in the face, but it was a necessary one for sure. And Perkins goes on to say that, even just having a higher salary doesn't necessarily mean that you're making more per hour when you factor in things like the cost of a longer commute or the cost of maintaining a certain lifestyle to go along with that job.
Sure.
Or just the extra hours that are required by that type of job,
Right.
So he's just making the point that you have to really think about what is the actual true cost of earning.
Yeah. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't factor in. Like, what is my commute costing me?
Right.
What is the stress of this job costing me? What is the extra dry cleaning costing me?
Just exactly. So we've talked about, experiences being so important and this idea of money being life energy. So now let's move on to rule number 2, which is invest in experiences early.
Yeah.
And he makes a distinction between, spending money on material possessions versus spending money on experiences.
Yeah. Because material possessions tend to depreciate over time.
Right.
And they lose their luster.
Yeah.
You buy a fancy car after a while, it's just a car.
Yeah, just a car.
But experiences, they actually appreciate in value over time through what he calls the memory dividend.
Right.
And so the memory dividend is like every time you recall an experience, it's like you're reliving it a little bit and getting additional enjoyment out of it.
Yeah, it's so true. Like you think about a great vacation that you took. Okay, you had the initial enjoyment of the vacation, but then you come back, you're telling stories to your friends, you're looking at pictures, maybe years later a song comes on the radio or you smell something that reminds you of it. And every time that happens, it's like a little mini dividend of enjoyment that you're getting from that original experience.
Exactly. And so it's like these little mini dividends compound over time. And so the more experiences you have, the more dividends you're getting later on in life. And I think that's a really powerful concept.
Yeah, it's such a good way to think about it. And it's so true. Like, I remember back in my early 20s, I had a roommate, Jason Rufo, and we were both, dead broke, living in a tiny apartment in Manhattan. And he decided he was going to take like 3 months off of work and backpack through Europe.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, are you insane? Like, we're making no money. We have nothing going on. Like, and to make this happen, he had to borrow like a significant amount of money from like a loan shark, which completely freaked me out. And I was like, this is just a horrible idea. What are you thinking? And he just knew like these life experiences were going to be priceless. And he looks back on that to this day without a single regret.
And he's right.
Even with the high interest loan that he had to pay back.
Yeah. I mean, you can always make more money, but you can't always get back time. And I think that's a really important point that he makes in the book.
And I stayed behind, diligently saving my little pittance of earnings. And now years later, I don't have any, crazy memories that compare to that.
Right.
And he argues that your life is the sum of your experiences. And if you're not deliberately planning and saving for those experiences, you're going to end up on kind of a default path, getting to the end without having had those experiences that you would have chosen for yourself. He also tells a really touching story about his father towards the end of his life when his father, couldn't do much physically anymore. He bought him an iPad and loaded it up with memories, like a highlight reel of his college football days, and his dad just loved it. He would just sit there and relive those moments, and it was just such a beautiful illustration of the fact that you retire on your memories.
That's great.
When you get old and your body starts to fail you, your experiences are all you have left, and so I think that's a really powerful point.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good illustration of the memory dividend as well, because his father was getting this ongoing enjoyment from those memories.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just a one-time thing. It was something that he could go back to over and over again and relive.
So how do we go about quantifying the value of experiences?
So he talks about experience points, like in a video game, where you get points for doing certain things. And he says that, experiences give you these experience points. But then every time you recall an experience, it's like you get these little mini bars of enjoyment. And he calls those memory dividends. And so it's like these memory dividends compound over time.
So how does that compounding work with memories?
I think it works in a few ways. So one is just through simple repetition. The more you recall a memory, the more ingrained it becomes and the more enjoyment you get out of it. But I think another way it works is through sharing. When you share a memory with someone else, it becomes a new experience in itself.
That's so true.
And it kind of reinforces that memory and creates a new bond between you and the person you're sharing it with.
Yeah, it's like when you travel with somebody and you come back and then you have all these inside jokes and stuff
Yeah.
that nobody else would understand.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that makes experiences so valuable, is that they create these shared memories and bonds that you can't really get from material possessions.
Right. So instead of focusing on return on equity, like with your investments,
Yeah.
he wants us to be thinking about return on experience.
Exactly. And he says that the purpose of money is to buy experiences, and experiences give you this return through the memory dividend. And so it's like he's taking that classic investment advice of invest early, but applying it to experiences instead of just money.
Right. So invest in your life early and often.
Exactly.
He uses the example of like a daily Starbucks habit.
Yep.
That might seem like a small expenditure, but if you add that up over time, that could be a round trip plane ticket.
Right.
So it's really about being conscious of your spending and making sure that you're not spending money on things that aren't really giving you a return on experience.
Yeah. And I think it's also about thinking about the opportunity cost of your spending. So if you're spending $5 a day on Starbucks, what are you not able to do with that $5? Could you be saving it for a bigger experience? Could you be investing it in your health? Could you be donating it to a charity? Like, what are you giving up by spending that money on Starbucks?
Right. So let's talk about delaying gratification for too long. He gives the example of John, who retired at 38 with a massive amount of money saved.
And it seems like he worked too long.
Worked way too long, right?
Like he missed out on a lot of experiences. And now he's got this sort of Brewster's Millions problem where he's trying to figure out how to spend all this money.
Yeah.
And it's almost like he's got too much money to enjoy.
Right.
Because he's used to living a certain lifestyle, and now he's got all this money and he doesn't know what to do with it.
Right. And, I think a lot of people get caught in that trap of just working out of habit.
Yeah.
Even after they're financially independent, the thrill of making money can become an addiction.
Right. And it can overshadow the joy of actual living.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really important point he makes, and he emphasizes that dying with a lot of unused money represents foregone experiences and wasted life energy, regardless of the amount.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because we tend to think of money as this finite resource, but it's not.
Right.
The only finite resource is time.
It's your time, exactly.
And so if you're dying with a lot of unused money, it means you've wasted a lot of time that you could have been spending on experiences.
So this brings us to the concept of die with zero. He formally introduces it and ties it into the life cycle hypothesis.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
So the life cycle hypothesis is basically this idea that you should smooth out your consumption over your lifetime. So you should spend more when you're younger and less when you're older.
Okay.
And ideally, you should die with zero, because if you don't, it means you haven't maximized your enjoyment of your money.
And he says that most people don't actually follow this hypothesis. They tend to save too much for retirement, and they end up dying with a lot of unused money.
So it's kind of like the average lifespan is let's say 80 years.
Yeah.
Right? And you're spending the first 30 or 40 years saving like crazy, and then the last 30 or 40 years trying to spend it down. But it's harder to spend it down at that point.
Right, because your health is declining.
Yeah.
Your energy is declining, and you're just not as able to enjoy those experiences as you were when you were younger.
Right. And he's not saying don't save for retirement at all.
Of course not.
He's just saying be very mindful of how much you're saving and make sure that you're not depriving your younger self of experiences in order to fund a future self that might not even be able to enjoy them.
Exactly.
So this brings up the natural concern of healthcare and old age,
Yeah.
I think most people's biggest fear is running out of money in retirement.
Right.
So how does Perkins address that?
So he acknowledges that that's a legitimate fear, especially for people who have limited resources or who are just terrible at managing their money. But he says that for a lot of people, the bigger problem is actually oversaving.
Okay.
Especially for people who are very diligent savers, they tend to save way more than they need, and they end up dying with a lot of money that they never got to use.
He cites some statistics showing that median net worth actually continues to rise even into people's 70s. And then a lot of retirees, they spend down their assets very slowly. They don't actually end up spending as much as they thought they would.
Yeah, he brings up this Employee Benefit Research Institute study that found that retirees with a lot of savings, like $500,000 or more before retirement, they'd only spend down about 12% of their money after 20 years.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it is incredible. And I think it just shows that we tend to overestimate how much money we're going to need in retirement.
So how do we address that?
So he talks about a couple of different things. One is to actually calculate your life expectancy using some online tools that are available, like the Actuary's Longevity Illustrator or the Living to 100 calculator. And that can give you a more realistic idea of how long you're likely to live.
Okay.
And then you can use that information to kind of plan your spending accordingly.
So don't just blindly assume that you're going to live to 100,
Right.
Do a little research and figure out what your actual life expectancy is.
And then another thing he talks about is the concept of annuities.
Okay.
And annuities are basically a way to insure against longevity risk. So it's like the opposite of life insurance.
I see.
Instead of insuring against dying too young, you're insuring against dying too old.
Okay.
And so an annuity will basically pay you a guaranteed stream of income for the rest of your life, no matter how long you live.
Okay. Interesting.
And so that can give you peace of mind, knowing that you're not going to run out of money in retirement, even if you live to be 100.
So it's a way to hedge that longevity risk.
Exactly. And I think it's a really important tool to consider, especially if you're someone who's worried about running out of money in retirement.
Okay, so let's move on to rule number 5. Give money to your children or to charity when it has the most impact.
Okay.
This is a big one. A lot of people think that dying with zero is a very selfish concept. What about the kids?
Yeah.
How does Perkins address that?
So he says that the best time to give money to your children is actually while you're still alive,
Okay.
because that's when it's going to have the biggest impact on their lives.
Okay.
If you wait till you die to give them money, it might be too late. They might be already successful. They might not need it. And he calls this in vivo transfers, which is basically just a fancy way of saying giving while you're alive.
I see.
And he says that these types of transfers actually make up a surprisingly small percentage of overall wealth transfers.
Really?
Most wealth is transferred through inheritance, which is, after death. And he says that this is often unintentional. It's not that people are deliberately choosing to wait till they die to give their money away. It's just that they're so focused on saving for retirement and for their own future that they don't really think about giving money away while they're still alive.
Yeah, it's like they're just so caught up in the accumulation mindset.
Yeah, exactly.
And that they don't realize that there's actually more joy to be had in giving than in receiving.
Yeah.
So how do we go about changing that mindset?
So he talks about a couple of different things. One is to just be more aware of the impact that your money can have on others, especially while you're still alive.
Okay.
If you give your kids money when they're young, it can help them get a good education. It can help them start a business. It can help them buy a house. It can really make a huge difference in their lives. And it's something that you can actually see the benefits of while you're still alive.
That makes a lot of sense.
He tells a story about a woman named Virginia Cullen who inherited a lot of money from her parents when she was 49. And she said that it was great, but it would have been much more helpful if she had gotten that money 10 or 20 years earlier.
Wow.
When she was a single mother struggling to make ends meet.
Yeah, right.
And so I think that's a really important point, that the timing of your giving really matters.
Yeah, it's so true. And he also talks about how as your children age, the utility of money for them also declines.
Right.
So giving them $1 million when they're 60 isn't going to have the same impact as giving them $100,000 when they're 25.
Exactly.
Because at that point, they've already established their careers, they've already bought their houses, they've already done all the things that they need to do. So the marginal utility of that extra money is much lower.
And I think it's also important to remember that it's not just about giving money, it's also about giving your time. Spending time with your kids, creating memories with them. Those are things that money can't buy, and those are things that are going to appreciate in value over time.
Exactly. So he argues that earning money at the expense of time with your family can actually be a deprivation.
Yeah.
Because you're trading something that's irreplaceable for something that is replaceable.
And I think he also makes the point that, a lot of people, they work so hard to provide for their families, but they're not actually present in their families' lives.
Right.
And so their kids grow up without really knowing them. And I think that's a real tragedy.
It's such a shame. And he uses the example of Sylvia Bloom, who was a secretary who saved diligently her whole life and left a massive fortune to educational causes, which is incredibly generous. But Perkins' point is, would it have been better if she had given that money away while she was still alive so she could see the impact that it was having?
Right. And I think he contrasts that with the example of Robert F. Smith, who paid off the student loans for the entire graduating class of Morehouse College.
Right.
And that was such a powerful gesture because it had an immediate and tangible impact on the lives of those students.
Yeah. I mean, that's life-changing money for those kids, you know?
Yeah, and it's something that he was able to see the impact of while he was still alive. And I think that's really important.
So it's not just about the amount of money, it's about the timing and the impact.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's a really important point to remember when you're thinking about giving back.
Right. So let's talk about the shifting balance between spending and saving throughout our lives.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people, they just follow these simple rules like the 50-30-20 rule,
Yep.
where you spend 50% of your income, you save 20%, and you invest 30%.
Yeah.
But Perkins argues that that's not the optimal way to think about it.
Right. Because your needs and your priorities change throughout your life.
Right.
When you're younger, you have less money, but you also have more time and energy.
Right.
So you should be spending more on experiences.
Right.
And as you get older, you have more money, but you have less time and energy. So you should be spending less on experiences and more on things that are going to improve your quality of life, like healthcare.
Right.
And so it's not about following a fixed rule. It's about being flexible and adapting your spending and saving habits to your current stage of life.
Right. And this ties back into this idea of the declining utility of money with age.
Right.
You know, as you get older, you just can't enjoy things as much as you used to.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize until it's too late.
Right.
You know, they spend their whole lives working and saving, and then they get to retirement and they're like, oh, I can't travel anymore because I'm too old. Or I can't eat at fancy restaurants anymore because my digestion is messed up.
Yeah.
And so it's really important to think about these things while you're still young
Yeah.
and you still have the ability to enjoy them.
Right. So the optimal balance between living for today and planning for the future shifts as you get closer to death.
Exactly.
So as you get older, you should be placing a greater emphasis on enjoying the fruits of your labor because you don't know how much time you have left.
And you don't want to get to the end of your life and have all these regrets about things you didn't do.
So let's talk about the impact of declining health on our enjoyment of life and the value of investing in our health.
Yeah,
This is a tough topic, but it's an important one.
it is.
You know, the reality is that our health generally declines after our peak years.
Right.
It might be gradual, but it's inevitable. And Perkins shares some anecdotes about how he and his friends have had to, you know, curtail some of their activities as they've gotten older.
Yeah, he talks about how he used to love to play tennis, but now his knees are bothering him, so he can't play as much.
Right.
And he talks about how he used to love to go skiing, but now he can't ski as many runs because he gets tired more easily.
Right.
And so it's just this idea that as you get older, you're not able to do the things that you used to be able to do, and that can really diminish your enjoyment of life.
And that diminished enjoyment affects how far your money goes. You know, if you're a skier and you can only ski half the runs that you used to be able to ski because your knees are bothering you, it's like the cost per enjoyable run has doubled.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think he also makes the point that a lot of people have this disconnect between their physical abilities and their mental image of themselves.
Right.
So, you know, they might think of themselves as still being young and fit, but their body is telling them otherwise.
He tells the story of the chiropractor
Yeah.
who, you know, was adjusting this guy's back, and he was like, wow, you're in great shape for your age. And the guy was like, oh, yeah, I work out all the time. I could still run a marathon. And the chiropractor was like, okay, let me see you do a push-up. And the guy couldn't even do one push-up.
Yeah. And he tells another story about his friend Chris, who was a competitive swimmer.
Yeah.
And Chris was convinced that he could still swim as fast as he could when he was in college.
Yeah.
And so he challenged Perkins to a race.
Right.
And Perkins was like, okay, sure, whatever. And then they got in the pool and Chris got destroyed. And he was like, I don't understand. Like, I've been swimming this whole time. Like, what happened? And Perkins was like, dude, you're 50 years old.
Right.
Your body is not the same as it was when you were 20.
Yeah. And medical research supports this idea that, you know, there's a general decline in health with age. And this decline has a big impact on how much we can enjoy life, you know,
Absolutely.
especially as we get into our later years. And so Perkins argues that we should be investing more in our health now.
Yeah.
Because it's going to pay dividends later on.
Exactly. It's like preventative maintenance for your body. You know,
Yeah.
the more you invest in your health now, the longer you're going to be able to enjoy life and the less money you're going to have to spend on healthcare later on.
Right. It's like an investment that pays off in multiple ways.
Yeah. And I think he also makes the point that health is the biggest multiplier of all.
Oh,
So if you're healthy and you have money and you have free time, you can do anything you want. But if you're not healthy, it doesn't matter how much money or free time you have, you're not going to be able to enjoy it.
Right.
So he introduces this three-pronged model of fulfillment, which is health, money, and free time. And he says that health is the most important one because it's the foundation for everything else.
So it's like a stool with 3 legs.
Yeah.
You know, you need all 3 to be stable, but if one of the legs is weak, the whole thing is going to fall apart.
Exactly. And I think the point he's making is that a lot of people, they focus too much on money and free time, and they neglect their health.
Right.
And then when they get older, they realize that they've made a big mistake.
Yeah, because the money and the free time are worthless if you don't have the health to enjoy them.
Exactly.
So this brings us to the Would I Rather framework and the idea of a personal interest rate for experiences.
Yeah.
Explain that a little bit.
So the Would I Rather framework is basically just a way of making decisions about how to spend your time and money. And the idea is that you should always ask yourself, would I rather have this experience now, or would I rather wait and have this other experience later? And he introduces this concept of a personal interest rate for experiences, which is basically the rate of return that you need to get in order to be willing to delay an experience.
Okay.
So for example, if you're offered a choice between going on a vacation now or waiting a year and going on 2 vacations,
Okay.
you need to decide what your personal interest rate is for that experience.
Right.
If your personal interest rate is 10%, then you would only be willing to wait a year if you were guaranteed to get 2 vacations that were each 10% better than the vacation you could take now.
Right.
But if your personal interest rate is 50%, then you would need to be guaranteed to get 2 vacations that were each 50% better than the vacation you could take now.
I see.
And the idea is that your personal interest rate should increase as you get older.
Okay.
Because you have less time left to enjoy those experiences.
Right, so the opportunity cost of delaying is higher. When you're younger, you can afford to be more patient
Yeah.
because you have more time to make up for it. But when you're older, you need to seize the day
Exactly.
because you don't know how many days you have left.
And I think he also makes the point that some experiences are just not replicable.
Right.
You know, if you have young kids and you want to spend time with them while they're still young,
Yeah.
you can't really wait 10 years to do that
Right. You can't delay that.
because they're not going to be young anymore.
You're going to be grown-ups, yeah.
So it's really about thinking about the timing of your experiences and making sure that you're not missing out on the ones that are most important to you.
Right. So to help with that, Perkins introduces this idea of time bucketing.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
So time bucketing is basically just a way of dividing your life into different time periods,
Okay.
like 5-year periods or 10-year periods.
Okay.
And then you can start to think about what experiences you want to have in each of those time periods. And the idea is that it helps you to be more intentional about your life and to make sure that you're not just letting time slip away without having the experiences that you want to have.
Right, and he makes the point that certain experiences are better suited for certain ages.
Right.
You know, like if you want to climb Mount Everest, you probably want to do that when you're younger.
Yeah.
And if you want to go on a cruise, you can probably do that when you're older.
Right.
You know, and so it's really about thinking about what's realistic for your age and your health and your financial situation.
And I think it's also about thinking about what experiences are most important to you,
Right.
because you're not going to be able to do everything, so you need to prioritize.
Right, you have to make choices. And he points out that ideally without financial constraints, most experiences would optimally occur in our younger years
Yeah.
when our health is at its peak. But in reality, a lot of spending is clustered around midlife. You
Yes.
know, that's